Alright ladies, so this video will cover the first portion of another of my favorite topics, which is evolution. With this unit, there's really sort of three chunks to it, and the first chunk is about Charles Darwin and natural selection, and this part is very much review from your freshman year biology class. So that's what this video is going to cover. It's going to move through it pretty quickly. And then we'll get to some kind of deeper ideas in natural selection, which weren't really part of freshman year. And then we'll get to some things I think are a little more fun, which is to talk about animal behavior, which would include humans, and the way evolution maybe shapes the way you behave. And then also evolutionary medicine, of course, because it's me. I have to tie this to medicine somehow. And so we're going to look at how we might take a different approach to some of the things we do in medicine if we also consider evolution to be very important. Okay, so here's your essential questions. Today we're going to talk about what evolution actually is, some of the evidence that supports it, some of the people that led to its introduction to the biological world, and then later on in class we'll get into how behavior is shaped by evolutionary concepts, and then also how evolution has started to change how we look at medicine. Now, when you write a paper or something, you have to put your sources at the end of it. What you'll find is that we're not going to use our textbook at all for this evolution stuff, because the evolution approach in your textbook is kind of like the very beginning of these notes. It's very basic background information. What I wanted to do instead is give you a much more interesting look at evolution and the way that we use it to think about the world around us. And so what I've really done is borrowed a lot of material from two guys who are professors at U of L. These guys are honestly pretty internationally known for their views on evolution. The top guy here, Dr. Guppies, I had one class with when I was at U of L. I think he still teaches one or two classes now. He's written several books, done a lot of speaking engagements really across the world, and his two major things that he focuses on are evolution and animal behavior. And so his talk and his class will kind of be at the roots of those notes we do. And he's also an expert in altruism, which we'll kind of explain what that is later on as well. And then the second guy is Dr. Paul Ewald. Dr. Ewald had a lab right next door to Dr. Wong's lab that I worked in, and I took a couple of classes with Dr. Ewald. He has had TV specials on the BBC and TLC, the Learning Channel. I think he maybe did one with National Geographic as well recently, and he is a very, very interesting guy, and he has written several books, and the main one, his bestseller, is this book that you see here, which is called Plague Time. And what Dr. Ewald looks at is how does disease evolve in our populations? That's his major focus. And he's really rubbed some people the wrong way, because what he talks about can be pretty controversial stuff in medical circles, because a lot of what we'll talk about that comes from his material is that a lot of times maybe the way we treat or approach getting hurt or getting sick is not the right way, and what he suggests kind of goes against what doctors do. And one, doctors are pretty intelligent people across the board and really believe they know what they're doing, and so they don't like to be questioned. And then two, the things they do make them a decent amount of money, and so if Dr. Ewald suggests maybe you don't get treatment for certain things, they probably aren't going to like that too much. So we'll take a look at both these guys and the things they tell us, and so I just wanted to give them credit here. Now this is a guy I do not know. He was dead before I was born. But Dobzhansky here is really sort of your most well-known modern evolutionary biologist. After Charles Darwin, he's kind of the next name that most people will throw at you in the biological world. And Dobzhansky was big in advocating for evolution and its importance. As you see here, this is his famous quote. But the way we framed biology has changed over time in terms of what scientists thought was most important. And really in the 1960s, we started to see this shift toward evolution as being sort of the underlying principle of it all. And what Dobzhansky told us is that nothing else is going to make sense. Nothing else we teach and we learn in biology makes perfect sense unless you have evolution as the framework. And you've kind of seen that this year. There have been times where we've brought up evolution, or there have been times when someone in class has asked a question and I start to answer it, and then I'm kind of like, well, this kind of has more to do with evolution, but because it's really hard to explain everything else without evolution there first. Now, really important here, basic definition of evolution in terms of what biology thinks about evolution is that this is the long-term change in inherited characteristics of a group of organisms. And it's very important that you highlight this group term. You want to remember that you cannot evolve, I cannot evolve, but a population of humans can evolve, right? A group of organisms can evolve. And what we'll get to here shortly is that Darwin explained to us natural selection, which does work at the level of the individual. So natural selection will work on you, and natural selection will work on me. And the end result of natural selection working on a whole group is that whole group can evolve. And so when we say evolution, we mean the change in a larger group. Now, Darwin suggested that his ideas on evolution could tell us where modern organisms or modern species came from. And he suggested that all of us originally came from one thing that he would call the common ancestor. Now, today's scientists really accept that natural selection and evolution exists and it occurs in the way that Darwin described, but it certainly wasn't always that way. So let's look at a little bit of the kind of historical background that came before Darwin. First thing you want to realize is that in the 1700s in Europe, where kind of the center of science was, most people believed more in religion than they did in science. And so people believed the earth and everything on it was created just a couple thousand years ago, and that it was created in roughly 7 days by some creator, and all of it was created at that time. These people also believed that because everything was created during creation, nothing has had to change since then, outside of us losing a few organisms like the dinosaurs along the way. Now, around the turn of the 19th century, so around the year 1800, a little after that, and again, as usual, you don't have to know dates for my class, but around that time, two geologists, two rock scientists named Hutton and Lyell, who you see here, they were kind of ghetto. They talked like this. Hutton and Lyell suggested nothing about biology, nothing about evolution, but they suggested that if you looked at the rocks on our planet, all the landforms you see, there's no way it developed in only a couple thousand years. Because of the changes that we can see occurring so slowly during a lifetime, it makes a lot more sense that our planet is millions of years old. Now, most people thought that these guys were nuts, but a few people took what they said to heart, and one of those people, a few years later, was Charles Darwin. Now, another person who agreed fully with Hutton and Lyell was a French guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and you might remember Lamarck's name from when you were freshmen. Lamarck was one of the first people to really document an explanation for evolution. And Lamarck came up with an idea that you might want to write down. And his idea was called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now today, we call this Lamarckian Inheritance in reference to him. But at his time, he didn't name it after himself. He just called it the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And what he said is that throughout your lifetime, changes in your behavior or your habits will bring about changes in your structures. And those structural changes that occur to your body during your lifetime can be passed on to the next generation, causing over those millions of years that Hutton and Lyell suggested were available on the earth, it causes an organism to change. Now, the classic Lamarckian organism that he described is the giraffe. Right? And what Lamarck said is that originally the giraffe was no different than any other ungulate like it, so any other deer or something. And if you really think about it, a giraffe kind of does look like a deer, just a really, really big and weird looking one. But what Lamarck suggested is that these special ones lived somewhere where all the food was up really high. And so those giraffes had to stretch up as high as they could to reach even the lowest branches and eat their food. And by doing that every single day to eat, these giraffes got a little bit taller, a little bit longer. Then they had kids that started out a little bit longer, but see, in that same place, that same environment, the food was gone from those lower branches. So these giraffes had to stretch a little further to get to the food that was high up. And then the next generation had to stretch a little bit further, and the next generation, and the next, until eventually you ended up with a giraffe that had way stretched out legs, and way stretched out neck, and way stretched out face, and way stretched out tongue, all as a result of the stretching that occurred within a lifetime. Now, Lamarck was pretty sure of himself that this is how it worked, and it really was a pretty good hypothesis. In fact, there are scientists today that still suggest that some of what Lamarck described probably can happen. One of the best examples of this, and you don't have to try to write this down or anything, is a Russian scientist named Lysenko. And Lysenko says that plants will sort of adapt to the climate around them, and the next generation will be ready with that adaptation. So basically, like he studies something called winter wheat, and if this wheat can grow in a really cold winter, then the next generation of wheat will already be able to grow in that winter. There's just one big problem, and I think you already know what it is if you remember from freshman year or things. And the big problem is that we can't change your DNA. And it's your DNA that gets passed down from one generation to the next. So no matter what you do throughout your life, you won't modify those genes. So those structural changes or whatever else that you pick up throughout your lifetime, those acquired characteristics, aren't in your genes, and so they don't get passed on. Got this creepy picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was very young. I could work out every day and probably do some drugs here as well and become as strong as these weightlifter guys. It doesn't mean that my kid is going to be any more inclined to have big muscles when they're born, because bulking up my muscles or anything like that, it doesn't change my genes. It doesn't change my DNA. Now, you can't really blame Lamarck. I mean, he was just unlucky, because really, Lamarck was writing about this in the early 1800s, 1809, 1810. Mendel didn't come around until 1859 or 1860 or so. So there were no ideas on genetics. Now this is also interesting because, as we'll see in a moment, Charles Darwin was working in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. He also didn't know about Mendel and he didn't know about genetics. He just got lucky. He had some ideas that ended up melding really well with what Mendel said, and together they kind of reshaped the way we look at genetics and the way we look at evolution. And he was just lucky because his ideas fit what Mendel told us. That was a random side note that I think is interesting. No one cared at all about Mendel. When Mendel's ideas came out, and I think I said this back when we learned that stuff, no one paid attention. The only reason people started to pay attention to Mendel is because Darwin told them they should. And Darwin said, look, this explains everything that I was saying. And so then together, around the year 1900 or a little later, people started to give credence to both Darwin's theory of natural selection and Mendel's ideas on inheritance. Now, another thing that you maybe didn't know, and I'm going to go real fast here because this is not real critical, is that Charles Darwin was not the first Darwin that wrote about evolution. And he, in fact, he was not the first Darwin to have some of the same ideas that he published. His grandfather was named Erasmus Darwin. He was a very large man, as you see in this picture, a very heavy-set guy. And Erasmus Darwin was a physician. He was a doctor. And he wrote a book called Zoonomia. And honestly, when this book was published, people thought he was nuts. They really thought he was getting a little older. They thought he was kind of going nuts, literally. Senility was kicking in, and he was kind of losing it. But some of the ideas he had are not that crazy when we think about what we know today and what people started to believe later on down the line with his grandson Charles. First thing he hypothesized is that we all came from some very simple life form that he called a single filament. And over millions of years, this filament changed in multiple ways to give rise to different types of smaller organisms, which then gave rise to larger organisms. We still don't know exactly how this worked, but that's probably pretty close to what happened. Now, Erasmus in his book also suggested some other crazy stuff. The first one is that humans initially walked on all four, hands and feet. We still don't know if that's totally accurate either, but it seems to kind of make sense when you look at all the other four-legged creatures around us that use all four of their limbs to walk with. He also suggested that we descended from primates, which we probably know is sort of true today. It doesn't mean that a chimpanzee woke up one morning and was a human, but we probably are very closely related to them. We know now based on genetics, and so that probably is sort of true. And Erasmus also went on to write a lot about how humans are not yet fully adapted to bipedalism, or walking on our 2 feet. And more or less, he said that's why we're clumsy, is because based on evolution, we're not ready for that. Now, he's kind of off base there. I mean, our bone structure is set up differently than our four-legged friends, and if we were to try to walk on all fours, we would struggle. But there maybe is something to that, too, that our body's not perfectly made for walking on 2 feet. Now, the biggest thing is that Erasmus discussed a struggle for existence, which led organisms to evolve. Organisms kind of competing with each other to be the best thing that would then move on to the next generation. But he couldn't tie all of his ideas together, and essentially he also struggled with what is inheritance. He also, really before Lamarck was even there, published ideas on acquired characteristics. But because everybody else thought he was crazy for everything else, he didn't really get any credit for that either. What's interesting is that Charles Darwin came along later, and he really just refined this concept of struggling for existence. And he rephrased it to something you've probably heard of before, and that's survival of the fittest. But he uses the term struggle for existence early in his book, some say as sort of a nod to his grandfather, that, he'd kind of maybe grown up hearing about this stuff and had just made it better. Now, we kind of go through the Darwin story freshman year. It's a big part of the freshman textbook, and I'm not going to go through all that with you again, but, he was potentially going to go into the religious life, and then he was potentially going to be a doctor, but then he became a naturalist, which is just sort of an expert of the world around you and the life that's in it, the animals and the plants and everything like that. Today, we don't generally see naturalists too much. We see professors of science, and then we see people maybe who work in the forests or things like that, and they're sort of like naturalists too. But naturalists generally were explorers, and they went out and they documented plants and animals that they saw, and so that's what Darwin went into. He was meticulous, and he collected lots of different species, and he wrote a lot of different notes and several books as well on these concepts. And his most famous voyage, of course, his big voyage, was the one on the Beagle, which took several years to complete. His job was to document everything they found, potentially on new land masses that they went to that people had not been on before. And so that started in 1831, where they left England here, and then followed this pathway really across the globe, hitting on several different continents over large bodies of water. But then that famous landing was on the Galapagos Islands, actually fairly early in his trip, that so much of his evidence came from, and so much of what he taught us derived from the Galapagos Islands. Now, what's interesting is he studied a lot of creatures on a lot of different places too, but he focused a lot on the Galapagos in the main book that he wrote, and that's what's kind of become famous now, as well as his studies on the Galapagos Islands. When Darwin was on the Galapagos, he noticed something really interesting, and that is that each of the islands there in the Galapagos kind of had some slight differences to its climate, but maybe more importantly, also had a climate that was different from the closest mainland, which was the western part of South America, And then he started to really take a lot of observations on 3 types of organism that you see here at the top of the screen. He studied giant tortoises. A couple of these you can see at the Louisville Zoo. He studied a group of birds called finches. And he studied something that a lot of people didn't know about, which is a marine iguana. And he had a lot of interesting stuff about the marine iguana that often goes overlooked by a lot of scientists. They've heard of the finches, they've heard of the turtles, but they haven't heard about the iguanas. Now, each of these species of animals differed from each other. Basically, he found a different kind of version of each of these guys on the different islands of the Galapagos. But what became kind of more fascinating to him, especially when he got back to England, is that there were not other species documented on Earth that were like these. So the question becomes, how did they get on these islands? And he also noticed that a lot of similar creatures lived on South America, but nothing that was exactly like what he found in the Galapagos. So he started to wonder, where did they come from? And did they maybe have some sort of relationship with those ones in South America? So, first thing he asks, could all the different species have started out as one and then separated into different species somehow? Second thing he asks, could they have started out as one that came from the South American mainland and then differentiated once it was on the islands? And then ultimately, if that is something that happened, how did that happen? What could cause this sort of change in things? And so when he returned to England in 1836, he started to write a book. And talk about a long process. It took him over 20 years to get this book totally ironed out. But in 1859, he finally published his book, which is technically called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. But a lot of times people just shorten it to On the Origin of Species. And this book was very long, pretty interesting, but it's a kind of a tough read. One thing I will say is that it is free on the Kindle store. So I'm not telling you, if you got a Kindle, to go get it for free and then read the whole thing. I've done it. Most biology major, dorks like me have done so. But one thing I'd say is, if it's a rainy day, if you're kind of bored, go to your Kindle, download the thing for free. Just read the very beginning. Read the introduction, because the introduction is simple enough that I think you could understand it. It's not that complex, really. But it's just really cool to read what he wrote. The guy that really came up with this concept that changed the way we look at science as a whole. To read his words is just kind of powerful. I know I'm geeking out a little bit here, but check it out sometime. Just read the intro, and if it intrigues you, then keep reading. But if nothing else, just read those first couple of pages for free on your Kindle and feel good about the fact that it makes sense to you after you've had my class. Now, in this book, in a lot of words, Darwin laid out his new hypothesis that described how small, randomly generated changes occur in a species over time. Now, again, Darwin came before our true understanding of genetics, so he'd never ever used the term mutation. Okay? But today we know that mutations are how you get these changes, right? If you have different characteristics than another organism, it's because you had mutations at some point. And remember from our work in genetics, mutations aren't always bad, right? Mutations can be subtle. Mutations might seem not to have changed you much. Mutations might actually be beneficial. But if mutations happen, that's how we get some variety, right? That's how we get different groups of characteristics. And what Darwin talked about is fitness. We'll define that better here in a minute. But Darwin said if a small change you have fits an organism better to its environment, then that organism will be selected for. And if the changes in the organism don't fit it very well to its environment, then it will be selected against. And because this relied upon the environment, not anyone else, having control over the process, he called it natural selection. And so, like you see in this little picture, if the food within these flowers is way deep in that long flower, then a hummingbird is well fit to this environment because its long, skinny beak can reach that nectar. Any other bird that has a shorter beak, not going to get to that nectar. Now, here's some cute dogs for you. Darwin actually came up with this natural selection idea, and he wrote about this a lot in his book by observing something that had been happening for hundreds of years, and it was primarily done by farmers in England. And what he observed was something that at the time they just called selective breeding. Humans choosing what organisms to mate together in hopes of producing organisms that have desired traits. So, for instance, livestock, right? If you've got a pig that's huge and is going to give you a ton of ham to eat and bacon, then you mate that huge pig with other pigs to try to get new huge pigs. If you have a cow that makes a ton of milk, then you mate that cow with other cows to get new milk cows that are better. If you have a huge cow that gives you tons of beef, mate that cow so that you get new cows that have just as much beef to them. If you have a really fast dog, back in Darwin's time, then mate that fast dog so it's a better racer. Now in today's time, we've got $1 million industry called the thoroughbred industry. If you've got a fast horse, you can make a ton of money by selling the rights to that horse to other guys or girls who mate their horses with it to try to get really fast offspring that might one day win an important race here in Louisville, Kentucky. So if you choose who mates, that's called selective breeding. Darwin called this artificial selection. Artificial selection, where humans are artificially affecting nature. They're choosing which organisms go together. Another couple of examples. A lot of times we do this still today with crop plants. Right? You have a really good hardy crop that grows well. Use those seeds next year, and hopefully you'll have another good crop. Another example, and the reason this slide has these dogs on it, all different dog breeds are technically the same species. In fact, all of our domesticated dog species that we have, even your little tiny, toy poodle or something at home, is the same species as a gray wolf that we see out in the wild. They're the same thing. What's happened over time is that humans have selectively bred them. They've chosen ones that were more docile, right? Didn't mind being around humans, and they've mated them together. And then over time, we've mated certain dogs together because they're prettier, because they're good at hunting, because they're fast. And we've created all these different breeds of dog through artificial selection. Now, Darwin suggested that this same process happens in nature, except there's no human there or anybody else to choose who mates with whom. It's just about nature selecting who gets to mate and who doesn't. Now, this can even apply to the animals we've already talked about. If a horse is faster or a dog is faster, they can get away from their predators, or in the case of a dog, maybe they can hunt down their prey. If a cow produces tons of milk, that will benefit its offspring, right? The calves that cow has will have plenty of milk to drink and will more likely survive. So nature will also choose which organisms are best. Now, the way that Darwin framed this is by considering that every population is going to be limited in the amount of resources that are available around them. So there's never going to be enough food or space or water or other things like that for an unlimited number of organisms. And because there is limitation, that means there will be competition over those resources, right? If we're all stuck in the school, there's only a limited amount of food that we have available to us, we're going to start fighting for that food. All right, we're going to compete for that food. So when organisms start to compete, some organisms are going to be better than others at competing. And those organisms that are better at competing are going to get the resources and are going to survive. And what Darwin said is that those organisms that are better competitors are more fit, or they have higher fitness. So fitness is your ability to survive and then therefore reproduce in your given environment. But remember that it's really important what environment you are in. Fitness, in fact, is entirely determined by your environment. I always use this with the freshmen, and it's kind of goofy, but I don't like to go in the ocean because I'm scared of sharks. But sharks are not very scary if they're just laying on the beach, right? And so where that shark is determines its fitness. A shark in the middle of the ocean, highest fitness I can think of. Fast, deadly, right? But a shark out in the parking lot at Mercy Academy, not very fit, right? Can't breathe, can't move, just kind of stuck. Now, think about us, or this tiger. I like this picture. We are pretty well fit to living on land. I'd say, in fact, if we put you in the same cage as this tiger, the tiger is a little more fit than you are at surviving. But humans are pretty good too. But drop either one of us in the middle of the ocean, and we're in trouble. We can't breathe underwater. The best swimmer in our class can't get away from most aquatic organisms that would want to chase them. We're just not built for that. And so for us, fitness is also determined by environment, and we're not fit in the ocean where sharks are extremely fit. Now, the question is, what allows an organism to be more fit? And the answer is the term adaptation, which is a word that Darwin used. Remember again, Darwin didn't know about genetics. He did not talk about mutation, but he said adaptations, an inherited change in an organism. So something changes about you and you give it to your offspring. Now what Darwin did accurately is he stopped short of Lamarckian ideas. He didn't say that you would kind of develop some new trait in your lifetime and that would get passed on. He would just say, hey, you have certain traits. And if those traits, those adaptations, are successful in you, it means you will reproduce, again, because you have higher fitness. And when you reproduce, your offspring will get those same traits from you. Meanwhile, another organism that doesn't have those traits and doesn't survive as well might not reproduce. And so in the next generation, there will be more organisms like you and fewer organisms like that one who couldn't have kids. Now again, this is totally, entirely dependent on mutations, right? Mutations that an organism has that it can then pass on to its offspring. This is kind of funny and hokey too, but you want to remember that organisms can't just get a trait because they want it or they need it. Organisms only get a trait when natural mutations occur. So what do I mean? I would really love, right, here's Mr. Burton. I would really love to be able to fly. It's going to be butterfly wings, right? I'd be a heck of a lot better at getting away in a dangerous situation. I could really get around easily. If I could fly, I probably wouldn't need to worry about a car. I'd love to be able to fly. But until there's a freaky human mutant who can fly, humans aren't going to start flying. You know what else I'd really like to be able to do? I'd like to have gills so I could breathe underwater. Yeah, that'd be cool, right? But until some weird human is born with a mutation that gives him or her gills, no human is going to do that. So we rely upon nature and chance for mutations to occur, and then if they're successful adaptations and mutations, then it's good for you and that survives. If they're not so successful, they won't stick around. Now don't forget too, that even though we say that being higher fitness means you're a better competitor, it doesn't mean you're just bigger and stronger and faster, which is what a lot of people think of. Right? It might mean that you're better protected, might mean that you're smarter, which is true in the case of most humans. Might mean you're better at hiding, like camouflage, or you might be that you have really good defenses. And so like this picture shows you. A lot of times we might think the lion is the key species in the Sahara Desert. It kind of is, but it's not the highest fitness. The highest fitness is this desert porcupine right here. Because that lion learns one time that it tries to attack that porcupine and gets a couple of those sharp quills in its face, and it's not coming back. And the porcupine survives. Now, anybody know what organism is maybe a little higher fitness than the porcupines? I'll give you a second to think about it. How could you attack these guys? From below, right? So, snakes are the one organism that is maybe a little bit more fit than these guys because they can attack them from below. So, I love these pictures. So natural selection, according to Darwin, tells us that organisms with higher fitness are more likely to survive, and therefore they are more likely to reproduce. And organisms with lower fitness are less likely to reproduce. So in our next generation, there's a greater number of those more fit individuals because they came from parents who had higher fitness. Now, one of Darwin's examples, one of many that was written in his book, was about the giant tortoises on the Galapagos Islands. Now, these pictures show you two different types of tortoise that Darwin documented. One type of tortoise right here has what we call a dome-shaped shell and has a short neck and short legs. This type of tortoise has what's called a saddleback shell, and obviously it has a long neck and longer legs. Now here's what Darwin observed. The tortoises that had the dome-shaped shells and short legs lived on islands with low-lying cacti that served as their food source. And the taller tortoises, these long-necked saddleback tortoises, appeared on islands that had taller vegetation that they ate from. And what Darwin noticed is that you, especially on the island with the taller vegetation, this one, you did not see dome-shaped shells and short necks because those tortoises wouldn't be able to reach the food, right? So on an island where the vegetation is up high, the long-necked saddleback shell tortoises survive and reproduce, and over a period of time, the entire population will be long-necked and saddlebacked. On the contrary, on another island where the vegetation is short, these dome-shaped, short-legged and necked tortoises could survive, and so you're going to predominantly see a population like that where the food is lower. So nature here, the environment, is choosing or selecting which organism is best suited in that environment. Now 2 examples, and then we'll be finished here. First example, I hope you kind of remember from freshman year because it's one of the main ones we look at, and that's the example of Biston betullaria, which is also known as a peppered moth. Now in the peppered moths, there's 2 color variations. There's a salt and pepper, almost white moth, and there's a very dark black moth. Now originally, here in this first picture, right, these organisms, these types of moth, lived in an area where there was light-barked trees that grew lichens on it, which are kind of like these little fluffy things on the bark. And as you see in this picture, I went ahead and threw a circle because it was so hard to even tell. You've got salt and pepper moths that blend in really well, and black moths that do not. So the black moths get picked off really easily by predators who can see them, and the salt and pepper moths are well camouflaged and kind of hide. Now, then you bring in the Industrial Revolution. Factories are built, pollution runs rampant. The lichens die that used to grow on the trees, and the soot and ash from these factories lands on the trees and makes them very dark. And check out what situation 2 starts to look like. Now the salt and pepper moths stick out like Christmas lights, and the dark moths blend in. And so you start to see a shift in the population of moths where you have more black ones and less salt and pepper ones. Whereas before, more moths were salt and pepper and less moths were black. So the environment changed, and what was fit changed, right? In situation number 1, higher fitness was a salt and pepper moth. In situation number 2, higher fitness is the black moth because now it blends in better. Now here's one thing that's pretty cool. They've continued to study these in England, and now they've improved the way we do industry. There's less air pollution. The trees are starting to lighten back up. The lichens are starting to grow on them again. And what scientists are seeing is that recently there is now a shift back to more salt and pepper moths in the Biston betullaria population. So if we shift that environment back, we're going to shift what is higher fitness back to the original thing too. Okay, last thing is guppies. Now, as we will talk about later, Dr. Dugotkin at U of L is doing some pretty cool behavioral studies with guppies. I know it doesn't sound too exciting, but they are cool studies. But what I want to look at first is something that's a little older, which is a study of guppies in Trinidad that occurred a long time ago. Now, we may or may not have done a little computer exercise when you were a freshman with the guppies. But what scientists have noticed is that the guppies, even though they're all the same kind of species, they will look different and have great variety in different parts of the stream. In fact, today, we now acknowledge that there are 2 different species of guppy that look very different, and that depends entirely on where they're found in their stream. Now consider 2 positions, okay? You can have upstream, and at upstream locations there are very few predators that might kill one of these guppies. The alternative is to be downstream, where there are tons of larger fish and big predators that would try to eat these fish. Now, here's what scientists have noticed. Upstream species, where there are few predators, are very brightly colored, like in this picture, very sexy fish, right? They don't really travel in schools. They just travel almost kind of on their own, very small groups if they have them. They're not very alert at all. You can do all kinds of stuff to them and they don't seem to get agitated. And they have very few babies. They lay very few eggs. Now, all of these conditions are things you can get away with if there's not very many predators around, right? In terms of finding a mate, it's much better to be bright and colorful and sexy. But bright and colorful and sexy would maybe draw attention to you by a predator too. So in an area where there's not very many predators, you can be brightly colored. Now you also don't need to worry about safety in numbers here because there's nobody trying to kill you anyways. So you don't have to worry about traveling in schools. You don't have to always have your guard up if there's no predators, so you don't have to be very alert. And nothing's going to come around and eat the few eggs you lay, so you can just lay a couple eggs and they'll hatch and be fine and survive. Now, the opposite things are all true if there are lots of predators. So if you look downstream, you will see a totally different population of guppies that act and look differently because what they have to worry about is getting eaten all the time. And here's what these guppies look like. Right? These guppies are very drab or dull, in color. And that's so that they blend in more with their environment and the predators don't notice them. They also travel in really large, tight schools of fish. Again, safety in numbers. A large group looks a little more daunting and a predator might not try anything. They're extremely alert and will run very quickly if you make any kind of noises or splashes or whatever, because they're always on the lookout for a predator. And they will lay lots of eggs when they reproduce, because odds are some of those eggs are going to get eaten by a predator, so the more you lay, the more likely a few of them might grow up. So these two groups of fish have adapted, right? They've become different things to fit their environment, because these guys are high fitness where there's lots of predators, but these guys are high fitness where there's not very many predators. And think about what happens if you alternate this. If you were a drab guppy in an upstream population, you are not sexy, right? You're never going to reproduce because the fish are going to choose to mate with the brightly colored ones and not you because you're ugly, right? But if you're a bright fish that finds its way into the downstream area, the predators are going to find you the moment you're there, and they're going to eat you first. So you're not going to reproduce. So the ones that have survived are the ones that work best in a given environment. So that's all the background on natural selection. We'll look at some more examples coming up in class, and then we'll start moving into some more interesting things with this too. Thanks for listening.